religion is glaringly absent as a protected class under Title VI. So Muslims are unprotected by the statute. Now, Muslim identity is not a race in any phenotypical sense. Indeed, Muslims are the most diverse faith group in the United States, composed of African Americans at 25 to 30%, Latinos at 5% and the largest growing community of converts, and immigrants from 75 different countries across the world. So their diversity makes it hard for a lawyer to prove that a particular race or national origin, as required by Title VI, is the grounds on which national security practices are being directed at Muslims. And yet what we have witnessed in the post-9/11 era is a type and degree of profiling and targeting that more closely resembles the racial discrimination historically experienced by African American and Native American and Asian American communities of all faiths. So, Muslims are being treated as a race, but more specifically as a suspect race, rather than as a religious minority to be protected from persecution. So for that reason, government officials and members of the public, who in fact believe in religious freedom norms, do not view targeting Muslims in national security and immigration practices as a threat to religious freedom. So my research led me to more fundamental questions with much broader implications for all Americans. Is our stated commitment to religious freedom meaningful? Does it apply equally to all faith communities? If so, then how can we explain the systematic subordination of Muslim communities, including physical attacks on and surveillance of their houses of worship, under the guise of national security? The explanation, I believe, lies in the racialization of a minority religious group, a process with a protracted and checkered history in the United States. So how and why a country where religious freedom is a founding principle in law and societal norms produces such overt prejudice and discrimination against Muslims is effectively the project of my book, The Racial Muslim. I seek to answer how the critical mass of Americans in the 21st century that hold unfavorable views of Muslims reconcile their mistreatment of Muslims with their nations and their own commitment to religious freedom. And more pointedly, how do Christian religious conservatives, who themselves decry assaults on their own religious freedom, justify their support, as shown in numerous poll after poll over the last 23 years, how do they justify supporting state practices that infringe on Muslims' religious freedom rights? So, I proffer that the explanation lies in how racism intersects with religion, to racialize a religion's followers and consequently exclude them from the panoply of religious freedom protections. Now, the way in which particular religious communities are racialized depends on domestic and international factors unique to that group. So, first I argue that the racialization of immigrant Muslims, which is what I focus on in the book, is grounded in a racial religious hierarchy, as opposed to just a racial hierarchy, to socially construct what I call the racial Muslim. Second, I offer a topology of the racial Muslim that explains why some Muslims are more likely to be targeted than others by private and government Islamophobia. So there are 4 factors that converge to racialize Muslims. The first is white Protestant dominance. The second is xenophobia arising from coercive assimilation into Western European cultural norms. Those 2 apply not just to Muslims. They apply to anyone who is not white and Protestant and anyone who is also an immigrant. The second 2, Orientalism and American empire in the Muslim majority countries, that's very unique to Muslims, and I'll explain now. But you must keep in mind that in this context, religious identity functions as a racial marker. So that is, the social construction of whiteness is shaped as much by religious identity as it is by skin color, hair texture, facial features, and other phenotypical or physical characteristics. Now, as a critical race theorist, yes, that's me. This is the first crowd that has actually clapped at that. Usually it's tomatoes, but okay. I recognize that race is a social construct. It is not a biological fact, but it does have real-life material consequences. Accordingly, racism arises from racialized social systems and societies where economic, political, social, and ideological levels are partially structured by the placement of actors in racial categories or races. So another way to think about it is racial stratification causes different races to experience positions of subordination or superordination in society and develop interests accordingly. So, races at the bottom of the hierarchy are often depicted as savage, uncivilized, unfit for self-government. Races at the top of the hierarchy are often depicted as civilized, liberal, peaceful, democratic. Now, phenotypical race, what one looks like, in American society has been and continues to be a central factor in the placement of people in a racialized system, which is the system we live in, whether we want it to be the reality or not. But religion also plays a dispositive role. This has always been true for blacks, who were racialized as heathen and inferior based on biblical stories, labeling them as the children of Ham, cursed into slavery. It was also true for religious minorities such as Jews, Catholics, and Mormons in the 19th century and first half of the 20th century, and for Muslims today, albeit for different reasons and with different consequences. So for example, Islamic tenets, regardless of whether practiced or believed in fact, impute onto Muslims inherent cultural traits that operate biologically to make them inferior in a white Judeo-Christian dominant society. Take, for instance, believing in jihad, 98% of which is nonviolent. I'm happy to answer questions about what jihad is in the Q&A. Believing in polygamy, Sharia, which is effectively Islamic law, or halakha if you're talking about Jewish law, or the canon in Catholic law. Hijab, fasting during Ramadan, Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, and the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. All of that is associated with a Muslim's purported innate sense of despotism, savagery, misogyny, and illiberalism. So for both religious conservatives and secular liberal elites in the United States, these religious beliefs and practices cast Muslims as outsiders to American national identity. And more specifically, it casts them as suspected terrorists.